A biased and racist teacher. A classroom full of tension. But there's a twist that no one saw coming, one that is about to expose years of hidden prejudice. Get ready for a story that will make you rethink what really goes on behind closed classroom doors. The bell rang, signaling the start of another day at Wellington High. Miss Randall stood at the front of her English class, her stern gaze sweeping over the students as they settled into their seats. The air felt thick with unease, a familiar tension that always seemed to accompany her lessons. As the last few stragglers hurried in, a new face appeared in the doorway. Jamila Kent stepped into the room, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The other students' eyes followed her, some curious, others wary. Miss Randall's lips tightened into a thin line as she watched Jamila make her way to an empty desk. "Well, well," Miss Randall said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It seems we have a new addition to our class. I do hope you can keep up with our rigorous curriculum." The way she emphasized rigorous made it clear she had her doubts. Jamila met her gaze steadily, but said nothing. As Miss Randall turned back to the board, the atmosphere in the room shifted, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The tension in the classroom was palpable. What happens when a teacher's prejudice collides with a student's quiet strength? Jamila's next move could change everything. Miss Randall cleared her throat, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Jamila. "Today, we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. Who would like to start?" Her gaze swept the room, deliberately avoiding Jamila's raised hand. After calling on several other students, Miss Randall finally acknowledged her with a tight smile. "Yes, Miss Kent. Do you have something to contribute?" Jamila straightened in her seat, her voice steady. "I believe the novel shows how systemic racism—" "Systemic racism?" Miss Randall interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. "My dear, I think you're confusing this classic American novel with some modern political agenda." A ripple of unease passed through the classroom. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others smirked, eagerly anticipating the drama unfolding before them. Jamila took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of her desk. "With all due respect, Miss Randall, the racial injustice in the book is a reflection of—" "That's quite enough." Miss Randall cut her off again, waving a dismissive hand. "Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it's written, rather than trying to impose your own interpretations." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Jamila's jaw clenched, her eyes never leaving Miss Randall's face. She remained silent, but her posture spoke volumes, a quiet defiance that seemed to unsettle the teacher even more. Miss Randall turned back to the whiteboard, her marker squeaking as she wrote. "Now, let's discuss the actual themes the author intended. Can anyone tell me about the symbolism of the mockingbird?" As the lesson continued, Miss Randall pointedly ignored Jamila's attempts to participate. Every time Jamila raised her hand, the teacher's gaze would slide past her as if she were invisible. The message was clear. Jamila's voice was not welcome in this classroom. Other students began to take notice. A few exchanged worried glances, their discomfort growing with each passing minute. Others, however, seemed to feed off the teacher's behavior, throwing sidelong smirks in Jamila's direction. Jamila's frustration was evident in the set of her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes. Yet she remained composed, her pen moving steadily across her notebook as she took meticulous notes. It was a small act of resistance, a refusal to be silenced or pushed out of her education. As the class neared its end, Miss Randall announced a group project. "I'll be assigning the groups. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Jamila's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the challenge for what it was. She squared her shoulders, meeting Miss Randall's gaze with quiet determination. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, students began to file out. Jamila took her time, gathering her things, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Just as she reached the door, Miss Randall called out, Miss Kent, a word. I. Jamila turned, her expression carefully neutral. Yes, Miss Randall? The teacher's smile was thin and sharp. I hope you understand that in this class, we focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your feelings from the curriculum. For a moment, Jamila said nothing. Then, with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her, she replied, I understand perfectly, Miss Randall. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Miss Randall staring after her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing the teacher's face. As the days passed, Miss Randall's initial hesitation hardened into cold resolve. She'd show that girl exactly who was in charge, no matter the cost. The next class would reveal the depths of her prejudice and test Jamila's strength like never before. The following week, Jamila entered the classroom with her head held high, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Miss Randall stood at the front, her eyes narrowing as Jamila took her seat. The air crackled with tension, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. As the lesson began, Miss Randall's focus on Jamila intensified. Every movement, every word became subject to scrutiny. Miss Kent, is that gum I see you chewing? She snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Jamila froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. She wasn't chewing gum at all. No, Miss Randall, Jamila began. But the teacher cut her off. Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out this instant. Miss Randall's voice dripped with disdain. Jamila's classmates shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, while others watched with morbid fascination. Jamila stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can, pantomimed spitting out non-existent gum, and returned to her seat. The silence in the room was deafening. As the class progressed, Miss Randall's behavior grew increasingly brazen. She nitpicked every aspect of Jamila's participation, from her handwriting to her posture. Sit up straight, Miss Kent. This isn't some casual hangout spot, she barked, ignoring the fact that Jamila's posture was no different from her peers. Jamila's frustration was evident in the tightness of her jaw and the way her fingers curled around her pen. She took deep breaths, struggling to maintain her composure as the onslaught continued. The class dynamics began to shift. Some students, like Sophie in the front row, shot sympathetic glances at Jamila when Miss Randall wasn't looking. Others, emboldened by the teacher's behavior, joined in with snickers and whispered comments. During a group discussion, Jamila raised her hand to contribute. Miss Randall's lips curved into a cold smile. Yes, Miss Kent, do enlighten us with your unique perspective. Jamila's voice was steady as she began to speak, but Miss Randall interrupted almost immediately. I'm sorry, but could you please enunciate more clearly? We can't all understand certain dialects. A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Jamila's eyes widened, her hands clenching into fists beneath her desk. The racism, once veiled, now stood naked and ugly before them all. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Miss Randall called out, Miss Kent, please see me after class. We need to discuss your performance. Jamila approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding but her expression carefully neutral. Miss Randall looked up, her eyes cold. I hope you understand, Miss Kent, that your attitude is becoming a problem. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable environment. The implication hung heavy in the air. Jamila took a deep breath, her voice low but firm. I understand perfectly, Miss Randall. I'll continue to do my best, as I always have. As Jamila turned to leave, Miss Randall called out, Oh, and Miss Kent, don't forget your group project presentation is due next week. I do hope you're prepared. Jamila nodded, her mind already racing. She knew the presentation would be a turning point. Miss Randall would use it as an opportunity to humiliate her in front of the entire class. But Jamila was determined not to give her that satisfaction. The air crackled with anticipation as Jamila stepped up to deliver her presentation. Little did she know, Miss Randall had been waiting for this moment to unleash her most brutal attack yet. What would happen when prejudice and power collided in front of the entire class? Jamila took a deep breath, steadying herself as she faced her classmates. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, determined to prove herself despite Miss Randall's constant belittling. The project board behind her displayed a meticulously researched analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. As Jamila began her presentation, Miss Randall's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. She watched like a predator waiting to pounce, her pen tapping impatiently against her grading sheet. The other students shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Halfway through her presentation, Jamila paused to answer questions. Miss Randall's hand shot up immediately. "Miss Kent," she drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel?" Jamila's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message." "Miss Randall," Harper Lee herself said. "I'm well aware of what the author said," Miss Randall interrupted, her tone sharp. "But I'm more interested in why you seem unable to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Jamila's hands clenched at her sides, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Randall. I've supported each point with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Miss Randall stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She strode to the front of the room, positioning herself between Jamila and the rest of the class. "Let me make something clear, Miss Kent. This constant focus on race is not only misguided, but also disruptive to the learning environment. Perhaps in your previous school such narrow interpretations were acceptable. But here, we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The silence in the room was deafening. Some students stared at their desks, unable to meet Jamila's eyes. Others watched with a mix of horror and morbid fascination as their teacher continued her tirade. "Furthermore," Miss Randall pressed on, her voice rising, "your insistence on inserting modern political agendas into classic literature is not only inappropriate, but also demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding. I'm beginning to wonder if you're truly capable of handling the curriculum at this level." Jamila's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she refused to back down. "Miss Randall, I respectfully disagree. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant today as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them does a disservice to the author's intent." "Enough," Miss Randall snapped. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. I suggest you take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for the academic standards of this class." As Jamila slowly gathered her materials, the weight of the humiliation pressed down on her shoulders. Then a small voice piped up from the back of the room. "But I thought Jamila's presentation was really good." Miss Randall whirled around, her eyes flashing. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Parker? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss Kent in detention to discuss your own academic shortcomings." The student shrank back in his seat, effectively silenced. Miss Randall turned back to Jamila, who stood frozen by her desk. "Well, what are you waiting for? Sit down, so we can move on to presentations actually worth our time." Jamila sank into her chair, her face burning with a mixture of anger and shame. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some sympathetic, others cruelly amused. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to take slow, steady breaths as Miss Randall called the next student to present. Jamila's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this continue. But what could she do? The teacher held all the power, and speaking out would only lead to more humiliation. For now, she would have to endure. But a quiet determination began to build within her. this wasn't over. As Jamila sat in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts of justice and retribution, fate was about to deal an unexpected hand. The classroom door opened, and Miss Randall looked up, a smug smile playing on her lips. "Class, I have an important announcement," Miss Randall declared, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've decided it's time for a parent-teacher conference regarding Miss Kent's performance." Jamila's heart raced, a mix of dread and defiance coursing through her veins. She knew her father would stand up for her, but the thought of him confronting Miss Randall filled her with anxiety. The other students exchanged glances, some worried, others curious about what would happen next. Miss Randall continued, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond her classroom walls. "I've requested a meeting with Miss Kent's parents after school today. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about her disruptive behavior and subpar academic performance." As the words left Miss Randall's mouth, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were steady, purposeful, growing louder with each passing second. The entire class seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a brief pause, pregnant with possibility, before a firm knock broke the silence. Miss Randall's eyebrows furrowed slightly, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Come in," she called out, her voice tinged with irritation. The door swung open, revealing a tall, distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit. His presence immediately commanded attention, and a ripple of recognition passed through the students. It was Mr. Kent, the school principal. Jamila's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and relief washing over her face. She glanced at Miss Randall, who was still blissfully unaware of the connection between the new arrival and her targeted student. Mr. Kent stepped into the room, his eyes quickly scanning the faces before him. They lingered for a moment on Jamila, a flicker of concern passing between them. Then he turned to Miss Randall, his expression neutral but his posture radiating authority. "Miss Randall," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Miss Randall straightened, plastering on her most professional smile. "Not at all, Mr. Kent. We were just wrapping up a lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird. Is there something I can help you with?" Mr. Kent nodded, his eyes now fixed on the teacher. "Actually, there is. I understand you've requested a parent-teacher conference regarding one of your students." Miss Randall's smile widened, clearly pleased that her authority was being recognized. "Yes, that's correct. I believe it's crucial to address certain issues before they become more problematic." "I see. And which student might this be, miss?" Mr. Kent replied, his tone neutral. Miss Randall turned, gesturing toward Jamila with a dismissive wave. "Miss Kent, actually. No relation to you, of course. You see, Mr. Kent is Chinese-American, so there's no way he could be related to her student." She chuckled at her own joke, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Mr. Kent's eyebrow raised slightly, the only outward sign of his reaction. "Is that so? Well, Miss Randall, I believe we should discuss this matter further, perhaps in private." Miss Randall nodded eagerly, already imagining the support she would receive from the principal. "Of course, Mr. Kent. I'd be happy to share my concerns about Miss Kent's performance and attitude." As Miss Randall began gathering her materials, Mr. Kent turned to address the class. "Students, please continue with your assigned reading. Will only be a moment." "Aye?" He then looked directly at Jamila, a small, reassuring smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a subtle gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Jamila sat up straighter, feeling a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced in weeks. Miss Randall, still oblivious to the true nature of the situation, led the way out of the classroom. Mr. Kent followed, pausing briefly at the door to cast one last glance at his daughter. The look they shared was one of understanding and shared strength. As the door closed behind them, a buzz of excited whispers filled the room. Students leaned across desks, speculating about what was about to unfold. Jamila remained silent, her eyes fixed on the door, knowing that beyond it, justice was finally about to be served. The closed door couldn't muffle the rising voices outside. Miss Randall's confident tone gave way to stammering confusion as Mr. Kent's calm filled the air. How would the teacher's attitude shift when she discovered Jamila's true identity? Miss Randall led the way to an empty conference room, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She turned to face Mr. Kent, a smug smile playing on her lips. "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this matter, Mr. Kent. I've been quite concerned about Jamila's performance and attitude in my class." Mr. Kent nodded, his expression neutral. "I see. Please, tell me more about your concerns." Miss Randall launched into her complaints, her voice growing more animated with each passing moment. "Well, for starters, she consistently challenges the curriculum. She insists on injecting her personal views into every discussion, derailing the lessons I've carefully prepared." As she spoke, Mr. Kent's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He remained silent, allowing Miss Randall to continue her tirade. "And her attitude!" Miss Randall exclaimed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "She's constantly disrupting the class with her unique perspectives. Just today, she gave a presentation that completely missed the point of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing solely on racial themes and ignoring the broader literary merits." Mr. Kent raised an eyebrow. "And you believe this focus on racial themes is inappropriate for discussing a novel that centers around a charged trial?" Miss Randall faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question. "Well, I believe we should focus on the universal themes, not get bogged down in specific issues." "I see," Mr. Kent said, his tone measured. "And how exactly has Jamila been disruptive? Can you give me specific examples?" Miss Randall straightened, regaining her confidence. "Of course. She constantly raises her hand to challenge points I make in class. She argues with other students during discussions, and her body language, the way she sits there, all defiant, it's clear she has no respect for authority." As Miss Randall spoke, Mr. Kent's expression shifted subtly. A hint of steel entered his eyes, though his voice remained calm. "Miss Randall, I'd like to ask you something. Have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might actually be a student engaged in critical thinking?" Miss Randall blinked, taken aback by the question. Well, I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way. But Mr. Kent, you have to understand, this girl is simply not a good fit for our school. Her previous education must have been lacking. Perhaps a different environment would be more suitable for her." Mr. Kent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. And what makes you think Jamila's previous education was lacking?" "Well, it's obvious, isn't it?" Miss Randall said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The way she speaks, her focus on certain issues, it's clear she hasn't been exposed to the level of rigor we expect here." Mr. Kent took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Miss Randall, I think it's time I clarified something for you. Jamila's previous education was excellent. In fact, I can personally vouch for it." Miss Randall frowned, confusion evident on her face. "I don't understand. How could you possibly know that?" Mr. Kent's eyes locked onto Miss Randall, his gaze unwavering. "I know, because I'm Jamila's father." The color drained from Miss Randall's face as the implications of Mr. Kent's words sank in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation evaporated in an instant. You're... Miss Randall stammered, her eyes wide with shock and growing horror. Mr. Kent nodded, his expression grave. "Yes, Miss Randall, Jamila Kent is my daughter. And I've been listening very carefully to everything you've said about her." Miss Randall stumbled backward, her hand gripping the edge of a nearby desk for support. The realization of what she had done, of the prejudices she had revealed to the school's principal, and more importantly, to a father, crashed over her like a tidal wave. "Mr. Kent, I had no idea," she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clearly," Mr. Kent replied, his tone carrying a weight that made Miss Randall flinch. "But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've displayed. Not only have you demonstrated a clear bias against my daughter, but your comments suggest a pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student." Miss Randall's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation. "Mr. Kent, please, I can explain. I never meant to—" Mr. Kent held up a hand, silencing her. "I think you've explained quite enough, Miss Randall. We'll be having a much longer conversation about this. But for now, I suggest you return to your classroom. We wouldn't want to keep the students waiting, would we?" Miss Randall numbly nodded and turned to leave. "Oh, and Miss Randall," Mr. Kent added, "I'll be sitting in on your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in observing your teaching methods firsthand." Mr. Kent's measured tone belied the storm brewing beneath as he stepped back into the classroom, followed by a visibly shaken Miss Randall. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Students straightened in their seats, sensing the tension crackling between the two adults. "Class." Mr. Kent addressed the room, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I believe we need to have an important discussion about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education." Miss Randall stood rigidly by her desk, her earlier confidence evaporated. She glanced nervously at Mr. Kent, then at Jamila, her mind racing to process the revelation she had just experienced. Mr. Kent continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It has come to my attention that there have been some concerning incidents in this class. Incidents that go against everything our school stands for." A collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Some cast furtive glances at Jamila, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "Miss Randall," Mr. Kent said, "would you care to explain to the class why you felt it necessary to consistently undermine and belittle one of your students?" The teacher's mouth opened and closed, words failing her. "Mr. Kent, I never meant to—" "Never meant to what, Miss Randall?" Mr. Kent's voice rose slightly, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Never meant to make racist assumptions about a student's background? Never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature because they didn't align with your narrow worldview?" The students watched in stunned silence as their usually mild-mannered principal transformed before their eyes. His words, precise and cutting, laid bare the injustices that had been simmering beneath the surface of their classroom for weeks. "Let me be clear, Mr. Kent continued, his eyes locked on Miss Randall. "Your behavior towards Jamila, and I suspect, towards other students of color, is not only unprofessional, but deeply harmful. You've created an environment where students feel unsafe, expressing their thoughts and experiences." Miss Randall attempted to interject, her voice trembling. "Mr. Kent, please, if I could just explain—" "Explain what exactly?" Mr. Kent cut her off, his patience wearing thin. "Explain how you mocked Jamila's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it focused on racial themes? Explain how you've consistently ignored her raised hand in class discussions? Or perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking simply because she doesn't conform to your preconceived notions." The color drained from Miss Randall's face as Mr. Kent recounted her actions. She glanced around the room, seeking any sign of support, but found only shocked and disappointed faces staring back at her. Mr. Kent turned to address the class once more. "Students, I want you to understand something. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from diverse experiences." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What you've witnessed in this classroom is not education, it's discrimination, plain and simple, and it stops today." The tension in the room was palpable. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement with Mr. Kent's words. Jamila sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief and vindication. Mr. Kent's gaze returned to Miss Randall, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "Miss Randall, your actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed through the proper channels. For now, I'll be taking over your class for the remainder of the day." As Miss Randall gathered her things, her movements were jerky and uncoordinated. The reality of the situation seemed to finally hit her. She cast one last desperate look around the classroom before hurrying out the door. The silence that followed her exit was deafening. Mr. Kent took a deep breath, visibly calming himself before addressing the class once more. "I apologize that you've had to witness this, but I believe it's important for you to understand that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in our society." He moved to the front of the classroom, his posture relaxing slightly. Some students looked shell-shocked, others relieved. A few cast apologetic glances toward Jamila, the weight of their silent complicity hanging heavy in the air. Mr. Kent cleared his throat, regaining the class's attention. "I know this has been an intense and emotional experience for all of you. We'll be bringing in a counselor to help process what's happened here. For now, class is dismissed early. Please use this time to reflect on what you've witnessed and how we can all work together to create a more inclusive environment." As the students filed out, many paused to offer words of support to Jamila. Sophie, who had always sat quietly in the front row, approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry I never spoke up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was scared. It won't happen again." Jamila nodded, a small smile of understanding on her face. "Thank you, Sophie. Speaking up is hard, but it's how we make things better." Outside the classroom, words spread quickly. Students gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd heard in hushed tones. As Jamila emerged, flanked by her father, a hush fell over the hallway. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with just a few students, then grew until it echoed through the corridor. Jamila walked tall, her head held high. The fear and isolation she'd felt for weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of empowerment. Her classmates weren't just seeing her now, they were truly recognizing her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Miss Randall faced the consequences of her actions. The school board was convened for an emergency meeting, and within hours, a decision was reached. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Miss Randall was escorted from the building by security, a cardboard box of personal items clutched to her chest. Students watched from windows and doorways as their former teacher walked to her car. Her career in education effectively over. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a somber recognition that actions have consequences. The next morning, as Jamila approached the school, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided her now offered friendly smiles and waves in the hallways. She overheard snippets of conversations about diversity workshops and plans for a cultural awareness club. As she entered her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, Jamila was greeted by a sea of supportive faces. The tension that had permeated the room for weeks was gone, replaced by an air of openness and mutual respect. During lunch, Jamila found herself surrounded by classmates, eager to hear her thoughts on how to make the school more inclusive. Ideas flowed freely, from diversifying the curriculum to establishing mentorship programs for minority students. For the first time, Jamila felt truly heard and valued. After school, as Jamila walked out with her father, they passed by Miss Randall's now empty parking spot. Mr. Kent squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently. "You know, Jamila, what happened here isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up and stand firm in the face of injustice. Jamila nodded, her expression thoughtful. I just hope it makes a difference beyond today. There are so many others who face discrimination every day, in and out of school. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of Wellington High, bathing the corridors in a soft golden glow. The school looked the same as it always had. Rows of lockers, the steady hum of students drifting to class, the distant echo of shoes on linoleum. But to Jamila Kent, everything felt different now. Only a week had passed since the storm in Miss Randall's classroom, yet the atmosphere of the entire school had shifted. The tension that had once clung to the air like a heavy fog was gone, replaced by something Jamila had scarcely dared to imagine: openness, respect, possibility. Still, even in this newfound light, shadows lingered. As Jamila walked through the hallway, backpack balanced on her shoulder, she caught snippets of conversations. Some students spoke of diversity workshops that had been announced during morning assembly. Others whispered about Miss Randall's departure, their voices tinged with both shock and relief. Yet more than once, Jamila noticed the curious glances directed at her, not cruel or mocking this time, but searching, as though her classmates were only now beginning to see her clearly. And she wondered, was this truly the end of the story, or only the beginning of a larger one? That afternoon, the gymnasium filled with restless voices. The principal had called for a school-wide assembly, something rare at Wellington High outside of sports rallies or graduation ceremonies. Students shuffled into the rows of metal bleachers, murmuring among themselves, eyes darting toward the stage at the far end where a podium stood waiting. Jamila sat with Sophie and a few others who had gravitated toward her since the incident. It still felt strange, being surrounded by support rather than isolation, but also reassuring. Sophie leaned close, whispering, "You okay?" Jamila nodded. "Yeah, just nervous." Before Sophie could reply, the low murmur of voices hushed as Mr. Kent stepped onto the stage. He looked calm, composed, but Jamila, watching from the crowd, caught the flicker of emotion in his eyes. "Students, teachers, staff," he began, his voice carrying across the gym. "What happened last week was painful. Painful for my daughter, painful for this community, and painful as a reminder of how prejudice can take root even in places meant to nurture growth." A hush fell deeper over the crowd. Even those who had whispered skeptically about what really happened sat straighter, listening. "But pain," Mr. Kent continued, "can also be the spark of change. And change is what we will pursue, together. In the coming weeks, we'll be launching new programs, cultural awareness workshops, mentorship opportunities, and open forums for students to share their experiences. These changes are not about one teacher or one incident. They are about ensuring that every student here feels seen, respected, and valued." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. Then, with a deliberate softness, he added, "I'd like Jamila Kent to come forward." Jamila's breath caught. 100 eyes turned toward her. For a heartbeat, she froze, every muscle in her body tensed. But then Sophie gave her hand a squeeze, and Jamila rose. Her footsteps echoed as she crossed the gym floor. When she reached the podium, Mr. Kent stepped aside, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder in silent encouragement. Jamila's fingers trembled against the wood of the lectern, but when she lifted her gaze, she found her voice. "I didn't want any of this," she began softly, her words threading through the silence. "When I first walked into Miss Randall's classroom, all I wanted was to learn, to find my place, to just be another student. But what I found instead was something that too many of us know too well: silence, dismissal, judgment, before I even opened my mouth." A ripple stirred among the students. Some glanced down, guilty. Others leaned in, riveted. For weeks, I told myself to endure it, to stay quiet, to let it pass. But silence doesn't make injustice disappear, it only allows it to grow. Her voice strengthened as she spoke, the tremor giving way to conviction. I'm not here to talk about Miss Randall. I'm here to talk about us, about this school, about the kind of community we want to be. We can't pretend prejudice doesn't exist, not when it hides in plain sight, even in classrooms. But we can choose what we do about it. She let the words hang, then continued. Respect doesn't mean agreeing on everything. It means listening. It means making space for voices that have been ignored or silenced. And it means holding each other accountable when we fail. I believe Wellington High can be better not just for me but for all of us. The silence was absolute. Jamila's pulse pounded in her ears, but she stood tall, her eyes sweeping over the sea of faces. And then, slowly at first, a sound rose from the bleachers. Applause. It began with Sophie, her hands clapping firmly, then spread to the students around her, then across the gym until the sound thundered like a wave crashing against the shore. Jamila blinked, stunned, her throat tightening with emotion. That night, after the assembly, Jamila sat on the porch steps of her home. The cicadas hummed in the distance, and the warm summer air smelled faintly of cut grass. Mr. Kent sat beside her, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "You did well today," he said. Jamila gave a small, tired laugh. "I was terrified," he smiled faintly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Jamila. It's speaking anyway. You've found your voice, and once a voice is found, it can't be taken away." And she leaned against him, the weight of the past week settling into something new, not quite peace, but a determination that felt even stronger. "Do you think it will last?" she asked quietly. "The change?" Mr. Kent considered this. "Change doesn't come all at once. It comes in steps, in choices, in small acts of courage repeated over and over. What you did today was a beginning. The rest depends on what we all do next." In the days that followed, Jamila noticed the subtle shifts everywhere. Posters went up about the first Cultural Awareness Club meeting. A group of students she barely knew approached her at lunch, asking if she'd help plan a mentoring program. Teachers began weaving new perspectives into their lessons, tentatively but sincerely. And though whispers still lingered in the corners, skepticism, resistance, even envy, Jamila no longer felt alone in facing them. Because she understood something now. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every student who had ever been silenced, every voice that had been overlooked. Her pain had become a spark, and sparks, when shared, could become fire. On the final day before summer break, Jamila walked the familiar hallways one last time. The echoes of laughter, the rustle of backpacks, the click of locker doors, all the sounds of a school that had always felt heavy with unspoken judgments, now seemed lighter. As she reached the exit, Sophie jogged to catch up. "So," Sophie asked, a smile tugging at her lips, "what's next for Jamila Kent?" Jamila paused at the door, the sunlight pouring across her face. She thought of Miss Randall's cold eyes, of her classmates' applause, of her father's steady hand on her shoulder. She thought of the work still ahead, of the courage still needed. With a steady breath, she answered, "What's next? Change. Not just here, everywhere I can reach." And with her head held high, Jamila stepped into the bright morning, not just a survivor of injustice, but a leader shaped by it, ready to turn her story into something far greater than herself. The echoes of applause that followed Jamila down the hall may have faded, but the meaning of her journey still lingers, etched into the walls of Wellington High, etched into the hearts of every student who witnessed the truth laid bare. What began as one girl's quiet struggle against injustice became a mirror held up to an entire community. In that mirror, they saw not only the cruelty of one teacher but the silent complicity of many. And isn't that the hardest truth of all? Injustice rarely survives on the strength of a single voice. It thrives in silence, in the downcast eyes, in the students who shift uncomfortably in their seats but do not speak, in the adults who notice bias yet choose to look away. Silence is the soil in which prejudice grows. Jamila's courage shattered that silence. With steady words and an unflinching gaze, she reminded her classmates, and all of us, that education is not just about books and tests, it is about the shaping of hearts, the nurturing of empathy, the refusal to let ignorance masquerade as authority. What Miss Randall lost was not simply her job, she lost the mask that had hidden her prejudice. And what Jamila gained was not just vindication, but a purpose, to turn pain into power, humiliation into resilience, and isolation into leadership. But the lesson does not end within the walls of Wellington High. It stretches far beyond. Every school, every workplace, every community has its unseen corners, where bias lurks, where voices are dismissed, where someone is made to feel less than they are. The story of Jamila is a story of vigilance, of what happens when one person dares to resist, and what can change when others finally choose to stand beside them. It asks us a question we cannot ignore. When prejudice speaks, will we stay silent, or will we answer? The answer lies in moments of choice, small and large. It lies in a classmate who chooses to speak up, in a teacher who chooses to listen, in a parent who chooses to confront what others would deny. And it lies in each of us, deciding daily whether we will feed the silence or break it. For Jamila, breaking the silence meant more than defending herself. It meant showing her peers that their voices mattered too. It meant teaching them that respect is not agreement, but the willingness to hear, to understand, to hold space for truths that may unsettle us. That is the foundation of any real community, not fear, not power, but respect. So, as you sit with this story, ask yourself, where does silence live in your own world? Who around you waits for someone, perhaps for you, to speak on their behalf? What injustice lingers unchallenged because everyone assumes it is easier to look away? Stories like this one remind us that change is not abstract. It is not a word in a textbook or a slogan on a poster. Change begins when we refuse to let a cruel comment pass unchallenged. It begins when we recognize the humanity in one another. It begins, always, with courage. And just as Jamila discovered, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act in spite of fear. Her story is a seed planted not just in her school, but in us, the witnesses. What we do with it will decide whether that seed grows. If Jamila's journey has stirred something within you, if it made you reflect, if it made you feel, if it made you think of your own unspoken battles, then carry it forward. Share your thoughts. Add your voice. Because silence builds walls, but stories build bridges. This is what Raw Black Stories is about. Bringing voices to light, telling the stories that too often remain hidden, and reminding us of our shared humanity. So, if this story resonated with you, don't let it end here. Speak in the comments. Share your perspective. And if you wish to walk with us through more stories like Jamila's raw, real, and unflinching, then let this be the beginning of that journey. For silence divides, but stories unite, and together our voices can change the world.